Welcome everyone to another Sunday night here for the Theosophical Society headquarters, London, England. I'd like to remind you really quick that there's a quick disclaimer for all of our talks. Please note that the view of our speakers and presentations are not necessarily the view of the Society. Tonight, we have Tim Wyatt. He is an esoteric writer, a lecturer, a researcher, and an organizer. He has been a broadcast and print journalist for almost half a century, working for the BBC, ITV, and Sky, as well as many newspapers, magazines, and online sites. He has produced numerous TV films and articles and currently writes for various esoteric magazines around the world. He's also an international lecturer for the Theosophical Society and other organizations. He also travels around Europe and across Europe. He is the founder of the School of Applied Wisdom based in Leeds, and also helps with the Leeds Theosophical Society, where he has organized the successful Roots of Wisdom conferences over the past 5 years. He has written widely on esoteric subjects, and his books include Cycles of Eternity, an overview of the ageless wisdom, and the recently published Everyone's Book of the Dead. And tonight, we are in for a big treat. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tim Wyatt and the Myth of Death. Tim, take it away.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon to study and examine this wonderful and cheery topic of death. Now, if you mention this in wider circles, talk about death, people accuse you of being morbid, and they accuse you of somehow infringing all etiquette when you talk about this. And yet, it's one of the most important things that we have to understand. And it's our lack of understanding of what death really is that causes really so many problems, because a lack of understanding about death also means a lack of understanding about life and about who we as human beings are and what our destiny happens to be. So I've quite provocatively called this talk The Myth of Death, because the way that many people understand death, particularly people of a purely materialistic persuasion, is that once your heart stops beating, once that electrical activity stops in your brain, once the blood stops flowing, once all life has passed away, then it's oblivion, it's annihilation of consciousness, and that's the end of it. Now, a lot of religious people believe in some kind of survival of a thing called a soul or a spirit after death. But certainly religions like Christianity do not any longer subscribe to the idea that we are reborn. Now, Christianity used to preach this in its early centuries, but for various complicated reasons, it decided in the 6th century to finally outlaw this idea. And things would have worked out a lot differently had it not done so. This is one of the many ideas that I explore in this book, Everyone's Book of the Dead. The reason you can't see the dead, by the way, is because it's embossed rather neatly on the cover. It's got lots of color pictures in it because people's attention span these days is so short that you have to break things down, and we can't really read the old theosophical books as easily as we used to be able to do it. Why did I write a book about death? Well, because it's an important subject, because I've always been interested in it, but primarily I wrote this book to try and explore some of the many ideas that have been entertained about death and dying and the after-death states and rebirth throughout human history. And I also wrote the book to try and take away the fear of death, because this fear of death haunts many people throughout their lives. And people put it off. That's why they don't want to talk about it. They look on it as being somehow a failure. You know, when we die, you know, is there something we could have done to prolong our lives a little bit more? And this, I think, is very much the wrong idea that we have in the modern world. And we somehow seem to think that technology will somehow solve all our problems, and it'll come in the form of a great white charger and just save everything. There are people who spend hundreds of thousands of pounds to get themselves frozen, cryogenically preserved after death, so that at some point in the future, when medical science has improved to the extent that it probably will do, that they can somehow be resuscitated and continue the life that they ended in 2020 or 2021, which is an absolutely absurd notion. And this shows you really the shortcomings of the material perspective. And this material perspective pervades everything, not just our notions of death, but notions about ourselves and about how the universe works. And so this means that people regard death as a tragedy. The word tragic is often associated with it, particularly during the current times when so many thousands of people have died during this pandemic. That in some ways has focused people's attention onto death, but I don't think it's necessarily changed their attitudes. So what is important to understand, and I guess this afternoon I'm probably preaching to the converted, but when I speak to my non-spiritual friends, of whom I have a great many, and you try and explore these ideas with them, they accuse you of all sorts of things. They say, oh, well, you believe in reincarnation because it's wishful thinking. You want to come round again. You don't want to die. You don't accept reality. And this is the sort of thing that they come out with all the time. And what they don't understand is that when we talk about death, we're only talking about the death of the physical body. That's all it applies to. Life continues, of course, on the inner planes once our bodies have expired and once their functions are no longer there. And they find this very, very difficult to understand. They find it difficult to understand that you can have consciousness without a brain. And yet, when you investigate these things and you look at things like near-death experiences, although they don't prove anything in themselves, they are extremely illustrative. And near-death experiences, whether they're undergone by anybody from any culture or background or age, have a broad similarity to them. And they often describe situations where, during operations in particular, people are now rescued from the dead, if we might put it that way, much more frequently than they were in the past. And people often in operating theatres report hovering over the operating table and seeing the medical staff working on them. They can often recall conversations or incidents which have gone on in the operating theatre, like someone dropping an instrument on the floor. But they also offer a unique perspective into what happens when the brain is no longer in its dominant position, which it normally is during physical life. And they often describe very similar instances of people walking down tunnels or tubes or passageways and emerging into bright light with music, being greeted by family members or possibly spiritual beings or advisors or guides, being taken on some sort of journey. And then they reach a point in this journey where they come to a barrier, which might be a hill or a stream or a wall or something like that. And the people who are with them say, right, this is as far as you can go. And people often say, but no, I like it here. It's great. It's much better than the other place. I want to stay here. No, sorry, it's not your time. So you have to go back. And often people are very, very insistent. No, I don't want to go back. It's much, much nicer here, much more pleasant. No, it's your time to go back. Now, these things are all very, very subjective, but I think one of the most powerful bits of testimony, which I've come across, is by a man called Dr. Eben Alexander, who wrote a very interesting book called Proof of Heaven. Now, Dr. Alexander was a very prominent neurosurgeon, but also very significantly, he was an arch skeptic about anything spiritual or any continuity of life after death, we call it that. But one day he contracted meningitis and his brain and his body completely shut down for a whole week, and he wasn't actually expected to survive. During that week, he underwent this incredible experience where he experienced different levels of reality, starting with what he called the earthworm's view, and then going into loftier realms where he met various entities. I really suggest you read this book. I've mentioned it quite in depth in my own book. But the interesting thing about this is that when he did eventually recover after 7 days, he was a completely transformed person, as many people are after these near-death experiences. Once they've been through them, they no longer entertain this abiding fear of death. They realize that it's just another state of reality once the physical body no longer operates. And in Dr. Alexander's case, he knew that this stuff couldn't have been concocted in his brain because his brain was completely inactive during that time and incapable of any kind of activity. So I think this is very powerful testimony, which you kind of need in a way in order to persuade people that there are realms beyond the physical. And there are many other proofs of reincarnation, well, not proofs, but certainly evidence of reincarnation. And I've tried to go through some of these in the book. One of the perhaps most fruitful areas of research that they've done over the last 50 or 60 years is by hypnotically regressing people into previous lives. I've actually had this done myself. I think we have to be quite open-minded about these kinds of things. But interestingly, when people are hypnotically regressed, they don't usually concoct ego-flattering incarnations of themselves. They're often born in very poor circumstances as peasants in villages or oppressed people. They're not Alexander the Great and Cleopatra and all the people and Napoleon and people like that. Although John Lennon claimed that he and Yoko Ono were Napoleon and Josephine, although I think he probably was joking under those circumstances. And when they analyze all these hypnotic regressions, they find often that people have incredible in-depth knowledge about the period and the culture that they were born into, the makeup of the society, clothes, vehicles, architecture, details about their everyday lives. And these often prove to be much more in-depth and knowledgeable than supposed experts in the field. And there are many other things which suggest reincarnation. There's been a lot of work done on examining the wounds and marks on people's skin, particularly very young children when they're born. And a number of researchers have come up with all sorts of interesting explanations and actually found that this child claimed to have been in the past life, or this person in the past life, indeed has a mark on their neck, and in their past life they died from a bullet wound or a stab wound. And there are numerous correlations of this, far more than one would expect through chance. There are various other things as well, but in my own case, I think my own knowledge about this goes way back into childhood, and it goes down to an intuitive knowledge. When I was about 8 years old, I was just an average child from a working class family in Yorkshire, and I was in the playground playing football one day. And suddenly I had to stop playing this game, and I walked across to the edge of the playground to the wall. And I stood there and I had this extremely profound experience. And I just knew at that moment, at the age of about 8, that I had been here before. I don't mean in that particular playground playing football with my friends, but I'd been on this earth before. And this was a feeling that stuck with me. And yet when I tried to talk to my parents about it, or I tried to talk to the lady at the Sunday school that I went to about it, I mean, they just couldn't answer any of these things. But nevertheless, I knew that I was onto something, and it really started a lifelong interest in death and what's associated with it. When I was young, I used to walk out every Sunday afternoon with my parents, and we'd often visit these really old, overgrown churchyards. And I was always fascinated, perhaps I was a bit morbid, but I was always fascinated by looking at the inscriptions on the gravestones, which are often covered by moss and ivy, and sometimes you had to pull the bits of ivy back to see the inscriptions. And on one tomb it would say, Frida Jones, died aged 39, plus 5 infants, 1848. And on another grave, you'd see someone, George Harrison, not the George Harrison, but another George Harrison, who died at the age of 98 in 1875. And I used to think, well, why do some people die as children or as babies even? And why do some people live to the age of 90 or even 100? And I couldn't rationalize this at the time. And of course, the vicar and my parents and my school teachers also couldn't answer this because they didn't have any kind of explanation for it. But it was very useful, although I didn't particularly know it at the time, because it really started a lifelong adventure to explore these more hidden truths of life. And also, from as long as I can remember, when I first started reading esoteric stuff when I was a teenager and attempted to read Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine unsuccessfully at the age of 17, these ideas became much more interesting to me. And I've never had, unlike many people around me, I've never had this fear of death. I've always felt that it was part of a continuum. And this is what makes Theosophy so fascinating for a number of reasons. Theosophy tells us, and the esoteric tradition tells us, that we are part of an ongoing continuum. We are infinite beings with infinite potential, and we are in charge of it. It's not just some angry God sitting on a cloud who's going to throw thunderbolts at us. We are in the driving seat. We are responsible for our own destiny. And so understanding death and dying is important. And it's important for another reason as well, because we have to understand if there is this continuity of existence, then there must be some controlling or moderating force in that, which we play a part in. And that, of course, is the law of karma, the law of cause and effect. Now, if more people in the world accepted that such a universal law existed, and if more people actually understood that their bad actions are going to reverberate on them at some point in the future, I think it would make people's behavior change quite dramatically. It probably wouldn't happen immediately, but certainly we wouldn't collectively as a species be the only one that's ever inhabited this planet with the capability of actually destroying its host. We wouldn't rape the earth, we wouldn't pollute the skies and the seas, we wouldn't deplete its resources, we wouldn't overpopulate the world. And also, morally, we would be very, very different people, because if we knew that our bad behavior towards others, our greedy, selfish, violent behavior towards other people, set out vibrations which were ultimately going to get wrapped up into our own karma, and we would face the consequences of that. If we understood that we are the architects of our own fate, then by definition, that is going to modify people's behavior to quite a large degree. And therefore, it's very important that people understand this. But although we're very ingenious as a species, although we've been very creative technologically and in terms of science, we're still actually quite stupid. And we're still very obdurate about learning new lessons and about accepting new truths. Now, this disbelief in reincarnation is a relatively new phenomenon. When you look down the corridors of history and you look at most societies, the vast bulk of them have believed that we as human beings are reborn. Obviously, some traditions have it that we can be reborn as trees or animals, but of course, the theosophical view is that once you have graduated into the human kingdom from the animal kingdom, in most cases, that's where you stay. And we don't go back and get reborn as a cat or an oak tree or anything like that. Nevertheless, this is a short-term aberration in terms of human history. And as it says on a badge lapel that I saw, reincarnation is making a comeback. And if we go back to the time when I was born in the early 1950s, and you'd mentioned the word reincarnation, most people would never have heard of the word. They wouldn't have had any concept of what this was all about back, say, in the mid-1950s. It was only known to a few intellectual type of people and people in the Theosophical Society and similar organizations. But over the last 4 or 5 decades, it's actually become, this idea of reincarnation and karma have become deeply embedded in popular consciousness. And this really started to happen, I guess, during the 1960s in particular, when a lot of the ideas from the East got imported into Western culture via people like the Beatles and Timothy Leary and numerous other writers of the psychedelic generation. 50 years ago, John Lennon released a song called Instant Karma, and the Beatles went on meditation retreats with the Maharishi Yogi. And so all these things have gradually percolated into a much greater degree of awareness than existed. There's a very accurate research organization called Pew Research, which I think is based in the United States, but they also do work in Europe. And when they've done recent surveys into things about reincarnation, they found that between a quarter and a third of people in America and the West now believe in rebirth. And in fact, in some of the surveys that they've done, they found that more people actually believe in reincarnation than believe in God, which is an interesting figure. So this idea that we are reborn is slowly getting back into our minds. And so it is gaining some kind of traction. But nevertheless, the bulk of people, certainly in the West, don't believe in this. The 3 Judeo-Christian religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism don't really believe in reincarnation, although there are esoteric parts of all these religions which do. Obviously, reincarnation features very heavily in Buddhism and Hinduism, and indeed Theosophy has got very, very close links to both of those great religions. But nevertheless, there are numerous variations even within Buddhism as to what happens when people die. I mean, the Tibetan view of what happens is different from the Theravadan tradition, for example, but we won't kind of go into all that. So there is an opportunity now. There is an opportunity for people to take this idea on board and to really start to explore what it means to be human. Because death is a journey, isn't it? And if we're going to go on any journey, we're going to go to Mallorca or New York or anywhere, it's good to know what the place is like, what you're going to do there, what the geography is like, and have some idea of how you're going to get there. So understanding death helps you in some respects to prepare a route map for where you'll go, and understanding that your first port of call will be the astral world, and then for some people, progression into the next world after that, the world that's described as the mental world or the heaven world, or to use the Sanskrit terminology, Deva Chan, the land of the gods. If we have some idea of the process of dying and what happens to us, then this is going to make it much easier. Because many of the writers, the masters of wisdom, the Mahatmas in particular, have laid great emphasis on the process of dying itself. And they say it's actually very important to have a calm atmosphere when we actually depart our physical bodies. Now, obviously, for a great many people these days, this happens in a medical setting, in a hospital or a hospice, or even at home, but there's often a great deal of medical intervention. But it's quite clear that if there are people present who are in a highly emotional state when someone is passing on, this can act as an impedance to people being able to sever and renounce that physical body. And it leads to remaining attachments with the physical body. And this can cause all kinds of problems. And, this is why a lot of the stuff, when people go to seances and stuff and they think they're contacting dead Uncle Joe, they're actually not contacting him at all, but some shell or shadow of him, or as it's called, a shade, which has been occupied by other entities. And this is why so many people, Madame Blavatsky included, have talked about the dangers of trying to contact dead people, because it's essentially quite pointless, really. But nevertheless, having an understanding of the process of dying is very, very useful to us. So let's just remind ourselves of what actually happens. Once the physical body stops working, we have another subtle body, which goes by a number of names, the energizing principle, which we'll call the etheric body. And this doesn't die straight away, but continues for some time, perhaps up to 24, 36, 48 hours afterwards. But after death, our astral bodies passes into this other realm, where it spends a certain amount of time. And exactly how long this takes, or how long we spend there, seems to depend on quite a number of factors. We find ourselves in this astral world, and I won't go into too many details about this. The astral world, of course, is the template for the physical world, and everything in the physical world has its astral counterpart. Now, when it comes to moving on to the higher world, the mental world, not everyone is going to go there, because some people are so unevolved spiritually, they've never had any higher thought or any spiritual aspiration of any kind. They've never had any of those moments when the higher mind comes into play, that it won't be necessary for them to go there. So they will tend to reincarnate fairly quickly. When we do decide to reincarnate, and I say when we decide, because it's quite clear that human beings do have a say in this, and we decide what body we're going to have, we decide our parents, we decide on our environment, we decide on our location. Now, this is all going to depend upon our karma, but it's also going to depend to a large degree on what tasks and missions we set for ourselves in a particular life, because we don't just come here randomly just to muck about and have a good time. We come here for particular purposes, to learn lessons, to discharge karmic debts with other people. And so we decide, maybe younger souls possibly will need some guidance as to do this, as how to do this, and some advice. But we come into this life basically with those lessons to learn, and with not exactly a blank sheet of paper, because karma is not a blank sheet of paper. It's something that is there and which we have to do. But karma works in a very subtle way sometimes, and we don't often get things happen to us until we're in a position to deal with it, because karma is not there to punish us or crush us, although it may sometimes seem like that. It's there to harmonize things, to rebalance and to equalize things. But what's crucial about reincarnation, a lot of the investigations which have been done into this, particularly the regression work via hypnosis, suggests that there is such a thing as soul groups. And by that, I don't mean group souls where we're all part of the same soul. I mean groups of individual souls who constantly come into incarnation in different roles, sometimes in terms of families or interest groups or in other situations. And so it's almost like we're part of a repertory theatre. And in each life, we're playing a new role and we're putting on a new play. So in one life, we all might be playing characters out of King Lear. And in another one, we might be playing the roles out of Romeo and Juliet. In one life, I'm your husband. In the next, I'm your business rival. In the next, I'm your son. And these roles will constantly change. And when they've done this hypnotic regression work, they found that large numbers of people, quite a large proportion, talk about this karmic script which is written on the inner planes and where things have to be discharged at some point in the future in order to preserve that harmony. So there's an awful lot of things going on here. You know, clearly our lives are shaped by where and when we were born, you know, by the astrology. We have our karma. We come into life with various attributes, which are sometimes called skandhas. And it all gets quite mysterious and sometimes difficult to disentangle. But the law of karma itself, although very mysterious in its workings and how it actually is administered, is essentially a simple and straightforward concept. It's that every cause has an effect and every effect has a cause. And yet some people do believe in a world where things just happen and they don't actually accept that there are causes. Some people will never accept any responsibility for anything that they've done until they suffer enough to change their minds usually, and that might take a great many lifetimes. But understanding karma inevitably means having a greater degree of responsibility and an enhanced sense of morality and ethics, because it's important to understand that as well as discharging the karma from previous lives and living out the effects of those causes that we set up then, we're also effectively shaping our next lives now. And karma is not just about what we do, although the word itself comes from the Sanskrit word kri, which means to make or do and signifies action in some way. Karma is also accrued through what we think and what we say, and through our emotions as well. All these things send out ripples and vibrations into the world. And obviously, if we are highly emotional people, the more highly charged those emotions, we're actually almost creating entities sometimes, which can linger on these inner planes for a long time. Certainly in a lot of black magic ceremonies, people put a lot of energy into creating spirits to do their bidding. And some of these can hang around for a long time. Indeed, it's said that some of the black magic experiments that took place in Atlantis were so powerful that the thought forms of these things are still in evidence today and still having some form of manifestation and effect upon the world. But the essential thing about understanding this process of death is to understand that really there are no such things as accidents or luck or synchronicity or chance. We might ascribe these words to these particular events because we don't understand them. But nevertheless, there's nothing without a cause, even if we don't understand what that cause happens to be. And so the difficulty arises. Most of us are not at all aware of our past lives. Even this hypnotic regression work is not always helpful, although sometimes it's extremely helpful, and in many cases it has proved extremely therapeutic for people. People have often undergone this hypnotic regression. In fact, one of the lead investigators actually started having these sessions done because he had this acute pain in his stomach, which he couldn't get rid of. And he went through a number of sessions and recalled a life where he'd been in a Mexican jail in the 19th century and had been viciously hit in the stomach with the butt of a rifle. And yet, as soon as he realized all this, the pain went away, and he tried every single cure and every other possible option. And he was so impressed by this that he actually went on to conduct thousands of these experiments himself. So we have to be a little bit careful about them, but we don't know what our past lives were by and large. Some people have, sometimes they have insights into past lives through sudden flashes or perhaps through dreams or other means. But basically, we don't know what these were. And why don't we know? this is one of the most common arguments that people bring against reincarnation. Oh, well, if we're reborn, why can't we remember who we were last time round and the time before that? But when you think about it, there are very good and persuasive reasons why this shouldn't be the case. We have a thing called a subconscious, where we repress lots of unpleasant memories. They're still there, but we prefer not to access every bit of pain and trouble that we've had, and so we bury them in the subconscious. Often we can't remember what we were doing last week or last year or when we were 14 years old. And so if we came into this life burdened by all the stuff that we'd done in previous lives, and we might have been incarnated hundreds of times, perhaps even more than that, if we carried the accumulated dweller on the threshold from all those lives and brought it into consciousness, it would make life extremely difficult. Because let's not forget the fact that we weren't always as evolved as we are now, and that we will have carried out some terrible things on our fellow human beings in past lives. We will have killed them, tortured them, exploited them, and done every other kind of unspeakable thing to them. And if we brought all that into a particular life, then it would make life now extremely difficult to live, and it would damage us psychologically. So in that sense, although we have karma, we have to come into each life with a relatively clean slate in order to be able to pursue what it is that we need to do. It is said by a great many people that as we progress and as we become more spiritually evolved people, we will stop seeing these lives as individual strings on a chain, if you like, and we will start to see a continuity of consciousness going in and out of physical bodies. And therefore, that will be a time, and this will be, I imagine, a long time in the future before we can achieve any of this. But then we will be in a position where we can see this continuum of life going on. Many of us, I guess, are going to die quite soon. And personally, I'm not at all worried about this. In fact, I'm quite looking forward to it, because what we have to remember is that if we just led lives on the physical plane, we will become so depleted eventually. Not just the fact that our bodies get old and wear away, but we will become so mentally exhausted with it. We do need periods of rest and recuperation. And this is where Theosophy is extremely helpful. Theosophy teaches very much the importance of cycles of existence, periods of activity, manvantras, and periods of rest and inactivity, pralaya, to use the Sanskrit words. And this is very, very important to understand that everything goes through this inevitable cycle, whether it's the smallest particle of matter or a whole galaxy. It gets born, it grows, it develops, it reaches a point of maturity, it then begins to decline, and finally its physical form is gone. It's over, it's all done. But this is not just, when we talk about reincarnation, when we talk about life and death, we tend to apply it to ourselves, and that's not surprising, but it applies to everything. It applies to civilizations, to ideas, to systems of agriculture, to fashion, to culture. Everything reaches a point, and then it can no longer exist, and no civilization in the history of the world has ever survived intact. And indeed, many civilizations had mini collapses and mini cycles within them. Egypt comes to mind. It lasted a long time, but it was invaded 18 or 19 times during all that time. So the world is in this state of constant change. This is another very important theosophical idea, that we're in a state of perpetual motion, and that even during these times of rest and recuperation, they are just a part of an ongoing cycle. And I find this personally a very exciting idea. Again, it's something that's very difficult to communicate to people who don't believe in any of these things and don't have any notions about it. But the fact that we are in this cycle, if we know roughly where we are in a particular cycle, it helps us to deal with that much more effectively. I mean, if we get to a certain age and know we're going to die in the next 10 or 20 years, there is no point in us being frightened about that. We have to embrace this idea that this is an inevitability. And this is why I think a lot of people come to these esoteric ideas, not when they're very young. Some people do. But a lot of people don't really start to ask these big questions and look at their own mortality until they reach a particular stage, and that's often middle age or beyond. But I was prompted to make this study of death when my own father died 25 years ago, and it shocked me in many ways because he died in a hospice and I lived some distance away. And I tried to get in to see him every day. And unfortunately, when he died, which was on New Year's Day, as a matter of fact, I wasn't able to be with him. But what disturbed me a great deal afterwards, when I went to collect his things and spoke to the nurse who had been with him when he died, was that he'd been absolutely terrified by this. And this is what happens to so many people. They reach this point where they finally see death as an inevitability, something that's going to happen to them in the next few hours, days, weeks, or months, and they finally start to think about it. But the fact that he, disturbed me a great deal, the fact that he was terrified to depart from this life, because he'd never thought it important, like a great many people had never thought it important to talk about these things before. And indeed, there is this cultural thing which I mentioned at the start of this talk, that people are very reluctant to discuss death, particularly, at parties or around the dinner table or anything like that. And it's something that they would prefer that we kept in the shadows, and we shouldn't, because death is as important to us as anything else. If we've had good lives, which I presume many of us have, despite all their ups and downs, if we've had a good life, why shouldn't we have a good death? Why shouldn't we leave this life in a state of relaxation and not worrying about all the things that we've worried about during our physical existence? Death is kind of like going on holiday in one sense. To go back to John Lennon again, I'm not quite sure why I'm quoting him so often this afternoon, but he did say that death is nothing. It's just like getting out of one car and getting into another. And I think that's a very apt and poetic way of describing it. But certainly when I returned to theosophy about 15 years ago, when I started reading a lot of the theosophical classics, immediately all these notions about death coalesced for me. And it was a very, very important period in my life to assimilate a lot of the things that I'd already believed in and had been studying on and off throughout my life. But I decided to spend an intensive amount of time looking into it. And I have probably spent the last 10 years researching this subject more than any other. And in fact, towards the latter part of my career, I actually worked as a funeral celebrant for a couple of years for people who didn't want religious funerals and everything. But for all kinds of reasons, this became quite difficult for me to do, particularly when at the end of the service, you saw people draped over the coffin and screaming and wailing and everything. And it was, it could be quite an awful thing to watch. But nevertheless, it was a unique insight into seeing how people cope with death. And of course, this week, death is in the news, not just because of COVID, but because of the Duke of Edinburgh, very prominent personality, perhaps what we might call a Marmite personality, love him or loathe him. But nevertheless, people have responded to this idea of death. Just to sum up and finish off, I would say that these attitudes, if they carry on changing as quickly as they've changed over the last 25 or 30 years, 40 years, then I think there is some cause for optimism. But there are two basic enemies to understanding what death is all about. And one of these at the moment, and I don't want to be too critical of science, but it is materialistic science, which refuses to accept there is such a thing as a soul. And Madame Blavatsky said this a century and a quarter ago. She said that science doesn't believe in the soul of things. The other major stumbling block are some of the world's religions, and particularly the way that people interpret these in a very literal way. These are great obstacles in not only understanding what death is all about, but understanding what we're all about as well. And Theosophy is fantastic in saying that it believes in freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And it doesn't tell you, you must believe in this. It tells you, you are on this journey and you are free to absorb the truths as you see them at your stage of development. And this is what makes it so powerful. Because in the future, rather than people subscribing to a mainstream religious view, I think people are going to start taking a much more individualistic view of their own spirituality, particularly as we move into this new age. And the old energies of the Piscean age give way to the much more synthetic energies of the age of Aquarius, which we're coming into. And I think there is going to be much, much more self-development amongst people and not the same reliance on mass religions. I know we look around the world at the moment, we see all kinds of intolerance because of supposed religion at the moment. So it's not going to disappear tomorrow. But over time, as we move more into this new age, I think there is cause for great hope. And I think science will also start to change within the next 20 or 30 years and start absorbing some of these truths. And the hard materialistic science, which is a hangover from the mechanistic Victorian period, I think is soon going to disappear. So we're in a world where death is all around us. Many of the structures that we thought were all safe and secure have come crashing down for all sorts of reasons. The world is in a state of ferment. Many traditions are dying. Many people are dying. Many ways of doing things are dying. And this has always been the case, but we just happen to be in a time where this is happening in a very accelerated way. So, look, thank you very much for listening. And I'm sorry about the interruption in the middle, but I don't particularly know what happened there. We can blame it on the scientists, perhaps.